We're talking rent vesting. I know this is a subject that is very near and dear to my heart. I wouldn't have built the portfolio that I've got now if I didn't use this. You use this as a strategy, building your own portfolio. But before we get into this detail, and this comparison is, I'm going to say, mind-blowing. Like when you showed me these numbers off air, I was like, no, let's double check this before we record it. But before we get into all this, can you tell me a little bit more about what rent vesting is for someone that's never heard of it?
Yeah. So in a nutshell, rent vesting, what it is, it allows you to rent where you want to live and you can afford where you want to buy, and it supports your living and your lifestyle.
Okay. So basically renting somewhere that maybe is a bit too expensive to own, but you can still get the lifestyle because it's cheaper to rent there.
Absolutely. And still allows you to move your portfolio forward and grow your asset base and work towards your goals.
And that's the major thing that's on the whiteboard in front of us. So anyone listening right now thinking, Todd, I'm on Spotify, I'm on the treadmill, I can't see a whiteboard, head on over to YouTube. This is going to make just as much sense if you are listening, but it's going to be so much better if you can actually see the visual that James has put together here. So go to Pizza and Property on YouTube. But for now, we've got a John and Jim scenario in front of us. Do you want to start walking us through the steps of this, James?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we probably want to look at is we're going to do some baseline assumptions here. So we're going to assume that both John and Jim earn $120,000 a year take home gross income.
Okay, so they're doing all right.
Yeah, they're doing well.
Not rich, but not poor. It's just kind of like pretty solid.
Absolutely. They've got no personal debts. They've got no credit card, and they're both pre-approved for $800,000.
Okay, so decent amount of money they can invest.
Yep.
Now, where's the difference come in here?
So the differences comes in is John's going to go down the principal place of residence line, and he's going to purchase a unit in Parramatta.
Okay.
Whereas Jim, he's going to split up his $800,000 and buy 2 investment properties in other areas around Australia for $400,000 each.
And so where's Jim living then?
Jim's going to live closer to the CBD in Sydney.
Right. Okay. So Jim's got a lifestyle that he otherwise couldn't afford, living in something that maybe was
Correct.
more than 800 grand.
Yeah.
But because of the yield compression, he's getting a lifestyle that is still higher end.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Gotcha. Okay, cool. And so let's start breaking down a few of these numbers because this is where it starts getting really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So we probably want to talk about as well is they've both got a $120,000 deposit at 6.5% interest, but we're going to note that John's going to go and pay down his loan at a principal and interest.
Yep.
Whereas Jim is going to be on interest only.
Gotcha. Okay, because it's an investment property or investment properties, I should say.
Yes, correct.
Yep. Okay.
All
All
right.
right. So as far as the rest of the data is concerned, what are the monthly expenses of John and Jim? Because they're obviously going to vary now. They've got 2 different scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. So looking at the 2 loan repayment requirements. So for John, he's looking at a $4,500 a month mortgage repayment.
Right. And so that's P&I though for 4.5 grand.
Yep.
Okay. So 4.5K coming out for John, but he gets to live in his unit in Parramatta.
Yes, correct.
What about Jim?
Jim, so he's looking obviously at slightly less at 3.9K a month.
3.9. Okay. And now, but he still has to pay rent as well.
Yes,
but
correct.
then he's got his rental income coming in.
Absolutely. So we're going to assume that he's paying about 2K per month in rent. On a 5% yield with his properties, it's probably important to note as well. He's going to have coming in 3.2K.
Now, for anyone listening to this that's maybe a little bit newer, what would you say to someone going, yeah, but why doesn't John just rent out his Parramatta unit for a 5% yield?
So he might have a smaller rental return compared to the assets that he might be able to acquire and rent out in the different locations in wider Australia.
Gotcha. Okay. So as far as monthly expenses are concerned, where's the benefit here then for Jim?
Yeah. So looking at Jim's outgoings, so factoring all this together, his total incoming and outgoing, he's looking at $4,200 a month.
Okay. So it's cheaper for Jim. He's owning 2 different assets in 2 different markets. Plus, he's getting to live closer to the city. I mean, maybe John wants to live in Parramatta. He might have family nearby, but otherwise, as far as the lifestyle affordability is concerned, Jim's getting a lifestyle that he wouldn't be able to afford if he was purchasing into it, and it's cheaper.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Okay. Now, as far as the mind equals blown side, let's start fast forwarding the clock. So John's purchase, still a smart decision. He's bought. He's not renting his whole life. What does his 800K look like in 20 years for his Parramatta unit?
Yeah. So if we look at it and we look at the ABS data across a 20-year time horizon, 2003 to 2023, we're looking at a Sydney unit at 108% growth.
Okay. So it sounds pretty decent.
Yep. Sounds pretty decent.
Okay. And what does that 108% work out to as a dollar figure for John at the end of 20 years?
Yep. So looking at throwing that across the next 20-year time horizon, if they were to stay the same, he'd be looking at an asset total of, wait for it,
Can we put a drum roll in here somewhere?
Potentially. 2.31 million.
Okay, so John's still a happy camper.
Yep.
As far as anyone's concerned, turning 800 grand into 2.31,
It's pretty good.
It's not a bad 20 years in the office. And how are we looking then for Jim as far as what was it, Queensland purchase first,
Yep.
400 grand?
Yep. Queensland Purchase 1.
What's that looking like over 20 years?
Okay. So we're looking at that over a 20-year time horizon, 179% growth.
Okay, so massive amounts more. And so what's that equating to as a dollar figure?
Yep. So we're looking at 2.2 million.
So 2.2 million. So far, it's like, well, that's not that much better. But we've still got another 400K in our pocket that Jim's purchased.
Absolutely.
Okay, what are we looking at? That was SA?
So we're looking at, regional SA,
Yep.
and that's at 201%.
And what are we looking at for 201% over the course for Jim of 20 years?
And we are looking at 2.7 million, which combining that together is 4.9 million.
So 4.9 million. So what was that? 4.9 minus what was the other one for John? 2.3?
Yep.
Minus 2.3. So there's a $2.6 million difference, if I've done my math right there, between John and Jim. So not only is Jim's week-to-week lifestyle a little bit smoother as far as cash flow is concerned, and yes, that is taking into account IO, like interest only versus PPR.
Yep.
But he's also living closer to the city. So again, if that's something that you want but you can't afford, this could be a way to do it. But we're not even talking about then bootstrapping this further. Like when I went down the rent vesting path, I moved in with mum. I looked at these numbers as like, what happens if I can really smash this out? This is still like pretty comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is just assuming that he's making these two purchases straight off the bat. He's not refinancing, taking the equity out, buying future purchases to really scale out his portfolio.
Because when John goes to the bank, more than likely they're going to be looking at him and going, sorry, man, there's not really too much we can do.
Yep.
But Jim's added to his income because that extra $400 on each of those properties is then what's that, 20 grand a year? So that's an extra $40,000 to his income.
Correct.
So technically, Jim's not on 120 anymore. Jim's on more like 160.
Yes, correct.
All right. I feel like I'm a bit biased because I've done this. I've grown so well with this. But let's talk about a few of the downsides because it's not for everyone. What are some of the downsides that you see?
Yeah, look, there is downsides to it. The first one's people always ask about, well, what if I've got to move places every year? I have to change over my tenancy.
Yeah,
that's probably the big one that pops up.
Okay, no one loves moving.
No one loves moving. So that is a risk, or that is a downside of this particular strategy.
Okay, what's another one?
Second one is you don't have any access to homeowner grants.
Okay, so if you've already used that up, probably not on the table, but if you're potentially leaving 10, 20, 30, 40 grand on the table, okay, that's something to consider.
Absolutely. And then the last one is if you do decide to sell one or both of your investment properties, you will incur capital gains tax.
Okay, so there's CGT implication, of course. So when John one day goes to sell his 2.3 million, his profit there, that's the government's not touching it.
Correct.
All right, James Nealis from InvestorKit. This has been an absolute cracker, mate. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Todd. Thanks for having me.